Leave the past, a new tomorrow waits for all who understand.
Good evening, everyone. It's a very great pleasure to be here and to talk about a subject that we have dedicated our lives to, which is the teachings of Paramahansa Yogananda and specifically Kriya Yoga. I want to talk a little bit about what Kriya is and what the history of it is. Generally, Kriya is mentioned and understood to be a particular technique of meditation. Now, we can't talk about the specifics of the technique because the specifics and the technique itself need to be given through initiation, and before that initiation happens, people need to prepare themselves by meditating and practicing some of the other techniques that I'll also touch on tonight. But Kriya is generally understood to be a technique of meditation and a technique of using the mind and the willpower to control the flow of energy around the spine and thereby withdrawing energy from the senses, which bring us outward, back into the spine and uplifting the consciousness so that we can meditate deeply. This technique of Kriya Yoga was not so much introduced to the world, but reintroduced to the world. In the late 1800s, around 1860, 1865, by the great Mahavatar Babaji, who is, as Paramahansa Yogananda said in his autobiography of a yogi, that Babaji lives in the Himalayas and he's taken on a deathless form. And he's there to help guide the upliftment of humanity during this entire period of time, has lived there for hundreds of years. But around the time of the 1860s, there was a change of consciousness, a change. Paramahansa Yoganandaji's guru, Sri Yukteswar, wrote a book called The Holy Science. And in that book, The Holy Science, he talked about the yugas, and the yugas are generally understood in India, but he said that there is a cycle of yugas that lasts 24,000 years, and that we have reached the bottom in about 500 AD, and now we're coming out. So the period of history that we know, that we're familiar with, is really the period of the lowest descent of the consciousness of mankind. And now we're coming out of that, and around 1700, between 1700 and 1900, we shifted from that age of Kali Yuga. And in Kali Yuga, the concentration is on matter, on form. People don't have an enlightened enough consciousness to understand more subtle realities. And so even the religion of Kali Yuga has to be taught in terms of form, in terms of ritual, in terms of patterns of behavior. But we've come out of that now. We've come into a new age, Dwapara Yuga, the age of energy. And so the introduction of Kriya Yoga at this time is a technique of energy. It's a technique of using the mind and using the will to control energy. Yoganandaji, one of his fundamental teachings was that the power of individual will is enormously powerful. He would take, sometimes Yoganandaji went to the West in 1920. In fact, we were at a satsang last night, and Devi ji was saying that he left from Mumbai in 1920 on the first ship that left India after the First World War and traveled to America. That ship was the city of Sparta. And so in a sense, all of us who lived in America and the West and have received these teachings, we have a debt of gratitude to Mumbai and all of you who are descendants of the initiation of Yoganandaji's passage across the ocean. At any rate, he went to the West, and it took a few years before he could establish himself. He arrived alone, barely knowing English, with only a little bit of money that his father had given him, and not having any people who were really his friends and supporters, except that he had been invited at that time to give a lecture to a group of religious liberals. And so they invited him to give a lecture. But imagine arriving alone, not knowing anyone, not having any contacts, and then from that point, building what he has built, a whole worldwide work and reputation. The autobiography of a yogi that he wrote, that came out in 1946, just after the Second World War. So it was published in 1946. More than 50 years later, it is still perhaps the most popular autobiography ever written. In Italy, about 5 years ago, the #1 bestseller on the nonfiction list was Autobiography of a Yogi in Italian. So that book that he wrote has had enormous power, enormous potential, and so many, many lives have been uplifted and changed by reading that book. So millions and millions of people have read that book. But it started with him leaving these shores of India, his beloved India, and going to America. And when he landed there, there's a group in America called the YMCA, Young Men's Christian Association. And it's a kind of a group that generally helps young people grow up with higher values. But they also have facilities that have very inexpensive rooms, a little bit like youth hostels. And that's where Yoganandaji stayed when he first arrived at the YMCA in Boston. And his first disciple there was a doctor named Dr. Lewis. And so Dr. Lewis came, and he and Master were sitting in this little bitty room in the YMCA in Boston. And Yoganandaji said, "It's going to be big, Doctor. I tell you, big." And Doctor looked around in this tiny little room, and he didn't know whether he was thinking that he was with a megalomaniac or whether this person was real. But now there are millions and millions and millions of people around the world that know about these teachings because of Yoganandaji, know about Kriya Yoga because of Yoganandaji. In that great book, Autobiography of a Yogi, he has a chapter dedicated to the science of Kriya Yoga. Now, he got it from his guru, Sri Yukteswar, who got it from his guru, Lahiri Mahashaya, who got it from Babaji. And Babaji re-released this technique into the world, as I said, around the 1860s. He re-released it. It wasn't that it was a new technique. He said that this technique has been practiced from ancient times because it is extremely central. It isn't like a belief. It isn't a religion. It's the central way to work with our own human nervous system, to withdraw energy into the spine and the subtle spine, and to lift that energy up. And even our language talks about this flow of energy. When you say, "I'm uplifted," in whatever language you say that, it means that you feel good. I feel high. I feel up. So you see the language reflects the flow of energy, up or down, the duality with which this world has been created. And you can also say, "I feel down, I feel low, I feel depressed," meaning that the energy is going down. It even is connected to our body, our posture, our body language. You never see somebody, "Oh, I feel so depressed. I feel terrible. I feel so low." Or, "I feel wonderful. I feel really, really uplifted." Even the eyes reflect that. So this internal energy flow is there in every human being. But most of the time, we don't think to try to take control over that. We don't try to think to take control over the reactions, the reactive process that we have. Things happen and they upset us, or they uplift us, or they elate us, they make us happy, they make us sad. And we think that it's the thing that is making us happy, the thing that is making us sad. But it's never that. It's always our reaction to things. Yoganandaji taught that everything, every circumstance is neutral. It's what our reaction is to that circumstance that makes it seem good or makes it seem bad. And that reaction is the same energy in our spines that make us sit up and be bright when we feel good, or slump down and sigh. Even our breath. When you're happy, you tend to inhale, and the inhalation becomes stronger. When you're sad, you sigh, and the exhalation becomes stronger. So this reactive process. So Kriya Yoga helps us control that reactive process. And once we begin to control that reactive process, then we have the key to happiness, and ultimately the key to joy, to bliss, and the key to spiritual upliftment. So Kriya Yoga is the technique that gives us that key, and it gives us that control over the reactive process and the movement of energy in the spine. And that's why it's not a religion. You can't say that the human nervous system depends on religion. Everybody, no matter whether they're Christian, Buddhist, Islamic, Hindu, everybody in the world has basically the same nervous system, don't they? Everybody in the world has the same physiology. So Kriya Yoga doesn't depend on religion or belief. It depends on working with the energies in our nervous system. In fact, Yoganandaji said that the true altar is our own central nervous system. And it's on that altar that we must worship. But I want to talk a little bit about Kriya, the technique, the word, and the cluster of techniques that are associated with Kriya. Now, I'm not a Sanskrit scholar, but we got a very interesting email from a man a couple of years ago, and he said that Kriya comes from a Sanskrit root, that the same root also gives us the word karma. And Yoganandaji in the autobiography said simply that Kriya is a word meaning action. But he said that in this letter that there are two kinds of actions coming from this Sanskrit root. One is action that does not create further binding or further karma. And the other is action that results in reaction and drawing back to ourselves karma. And Kriya is the kind of action that frees us from reaction and frees us from karma. In fact, one of the teachings of Yoganandaji is that the practice of Kriya, a single Kriya round of Kriya, is the equivalent to a whole year of living in this world. So you can do a Kriya in less than a minute. So is a minute worth 365 days? Well, it is in terms of freeing us from karma, because most of the time our actions in the world simply create more karma and more action and more reaction. And so we don't really progress very much in terms of our spiritual evolution in a year of a journey where the earth goes around the sun. Because all of that action that we do mostly just doesn't burn off very much of the old karma. It just creates new karma. But one Kriya can burn off as much as a whole year. So Kriya is the kind of action that frees us from reaction and frees us from being caught. Being caught reminds me, there's a series of stories, kind of folk stories in America, called the Uncle Remus stories. And these stories have to do with basically two characters. There's a fox and there's a rabbit. And the fox is always trying to catch the rabbit because he wants to eat it. And the rabbit is quicker, smarter, and he's always getting away. And so all of these stories show how the rabbit finally gets away. Well, this particular story, the fox decides that he can't catch the rabbit, it's too fast. But what he's going to do is he's going to create a doll called a tar baby. So he's going to create a doll out of sticky tar, and he puts it in the middle of the road where Brer Rabbit always passes. And so Brer Rabbit passes, and he says to the tar baby, he says, "Good morning." And of course, being just a tar baby, the doll doesn't say anything back. And so Brer Rabbit stops and he says, "I said good morning." And the baby doesn't say anything. And Brer Rabbit says, "If you don't say good morning back to me, I'm going to slap you." And of course, the doll doesn't do anything. And so Brer Rabbit slaps him and his hand gets stuck. He says, "If you don't let go of my hand, I'm going to slap you on the other side of your cheek." And he slaps him on the other side, and his other hand gets stuck. And he says, if you don't let go of my hands, I'm going to kick you. And he kicks him, and he gets totally stuck. And then Brer Fox comes out of the bushes, and ha, 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 now I've caught you. So that sticky old tar baby is like karma. You know, all of these opportunities that we have in the world, we say, oh, that sounds great. I'm going to take care of that when we get angry with someone. I'm going to slap you. I'm going to teach you a lesson. We just get caught. And I'm going to really teach you a lesson. We get more caught. So Brer Fox comes out of the bushes, and he's caught Brer Rabbit. Finally, after all these attempts. So Brer Rabbit, being really clever, says, oh, I hope you eat me quick. You can boil me, you can stew me, you can put me over the fire, but oh, Brer Fox, don't throw me in the briar patch. Briar patch is a patch of weeds with stickers in them with a lot of thorns. He says, don't throw me in the briar patch. It would be too painful for me. And Brer Fox says, oh, I'm not going to throw you in the briar patch. I'm going to eat you. I'm going to build a fire. And Brer Rabbit says, oh, thank goodness. I don't mind being eaten, but don't throw me in the briar patch. And finally they go through this, and finally Brer Fox says, well, if it's really that painful for him, I'm going to get back at him for all those times he's escaped me, and I'm going to throw him in that briar patch. So he throws him in the briar patch, and Brer Rabbit laughs. He says, I grew up in the briar patch. Ha, 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 and he runs away. Well, the briar patch is our spiritual home. We grew up in the briar patch. And so no matter how much karma we get in this world, we're trying to get free to go back to our home. But that attempt to get back to our home, it takes some sort of living that will free us from not only the accumulation of karma. If it were just working off past karma, it would be really pretty easy. But free us from the continual recreation of karma and being stuck. Basically, karma is that every thought, every action, every desire is like energy that goes out, and it's half of a circle, and that energy will have to return and complete that circle and come back to us. So if we are hateful toward a person, that energy is going to have to come back, and either that person or someone else will act hatefully toward us, and so on. Thousands and millions of those threads going out and repeating, coming back. Well, we could work that off relatively quickly if we didn't keep creating those threads. But that's the problem, we keep creating them. So Kriya begins to clear us from not only the old karma, but the tendency to keep recreating new karma. Along with Kriya, there are some associated techniques so Kriya in one way is a single technique, in another way it's a cluster of spiritual techniques. Yogananda, one of the unique gifts to the whole ancient science of yoga, was that he created something called the energization exercises, which we practice and which we teach at Ananda. And those energization exercises use the principle of tension and relaxation, but the use of the will to send energy to a body part and then relax and withdraw that energy. And so what Yogananda is teaching us, or helping us to learn through the practice of this technique, is the ability to decide to send energy and to withdraw energy. And when we begin to get control over that, we begin to get control over the reactive process that I was talking about. And so this cluster of techniques that we have begins to free us gradually. It isn't immediate. I mean, really the amount of time that we have spent creating karma is enormous, thousands and thousands of lifetimes. And so we've built up a lot of momentum of being stuck. So this technique isn't immediate like that, but it is, Yoganandaji said that it works like spiritual mathematics. He said, give me 5 youths of the worst kind, and if they will practice Kriya Yoga as I tell them to, that's a very important phrase, as I tell them to, if they will practice Kriya Yoga as I tell them to for 5 years, they will become saints. And so he said that this technique works like spiritual mathematics. It's extremely effective. In that book, he says it's the most effective technique for spiritual liberation by self-effort, because the grace of God, the grace of the Guru is more powerful than any technique. The love of God, the love of Guru is more powerful than our own self-love of things that we can do ourselves. Nonetheless, of all techniques of self-effort, this is the most central and the most powerful. And so the practice of Kriya Yoga frees us from this karma, frees us from the recreation of this karma. Together, people from Ananda, now as Shurjo was saying at the beginning, Ananda started in California with Swami Kriyananda in 1968, in 1969, and that's when I came to Swami Kriyananda. So I was actually his assistant in San Francisco before the creation of the Ananda communities and the Ananda Sangha that now has spread around the world. And at that time, what Swamiji was primarily doing was, he didn't have a community, he didn't yet have a group of people, a Sangha. He was just teaching. And he was going around as Yogananda did and giving classes. Now Yogananda, remember I was saying about him telling Dr. Lewis, it's going to be big, doctor, big, I tell you. Within 6 years of him saying that, he was going around America lecturing, and he would draw crowds to the very biggest halls in America. Carnegie Hall, which is a huge hall, holds several thousand people in New York City. He gave a lecture there, and the crowd of people was stretched around the block of people not only getting in, but trying to get in, and there weren't enough seats. And from city to city around America, Yogananda went, and he introduced this science of yoga and the science of Kriya Yoga. He himself initiated thousands of people into the science of Kriya Yoga. But of all of those people, not very many really, really dedicated their lives to them. And of all those who did, none of them were like Swamiji, like our Swamiji Kriyanandaji. He heard Yogananda give a talk in 1948 or 1950 at a garden party, and Yogananda very powerfully said that thousands of youths must go north, south, east, and west, creating these world brotherhood colonies where they can demonstrate that high thinking and simple living lead to the greatest happiness. And when Swamiji heard that, he dedicated his life to that. So not only was, when I met him, he didn't have a community, he was just teaching. He was, Yogananda said during the Depression in America, Yogananda was so powerful. When he would give a talk, he would come running onto the stage in his long hair. I mean, it was very uncommon in America in those days for a man to have long hair, and of course his orange robes of a Swami. So he'd come running onto the stage, his long hair flying behind him, and he'd say, "How feels everyone?" And they would shout back, "Awake and ready." "How is everyone?" "Awake and ready." He said, "All right, now you've got energy. Now I can talk to you." And so he had this enormous power and this enormous energy. And when he put that power out, it magnetized people. When he put that book, Autobiography of a Yogi, out, he put his power into it. And it's magnetized a whole world, really. People from all over the world now have read that book, and for tens of thousands of people, that book has brought them onto the spiritual path, including that for me. So Swamiji took up the banner of Yoganandaji, and he began these spiritual communities. The first one was in California, where Devi and I have lived basically our whole adult lives, and then across America on the West Coast, and then a community in Italy where hundreds of thousands of people every year come and study yoga there. And now, as Shurjo was saying, we have our first community in India, outside of Pune. Yoganandaji said that these communities will become the lifestyle for the New Age, the lifestyle for Dwapara Yuga. Why? Because I don't know if you've noticed, but there's some traffic in Mumbai. How many hours a day are wasted by people waiting in traffic? And so we're living in these crowded cities, in these crowded conditions, in ways that are not really very healthful, with pollution and all. And it isn't just here in Mumbai or in India, it's all over the world. I read an article a couple of weeks ago that there's a city in China, the pollution was so bad that they were having car accidents because drivers couldn't see the car in front of them and run into them. So all over the world, there is a kind of an unhealthy lifestyle. Well, we're going through changes, but eventually, probably not in the lifetime of any of us here, but eventually people are going to see that living in smaller groups with like-minded people, people who share their aspirations, share their spiritual desires, living together and reinforcing each other and drawing the best out of each other, that will become, Yoganandaji said, the lifestyle for Dwapara Yuga. And so that's what's coming. And Ananda is, please come in. Ananda is just the forerunner of this. Someday there'll be thousands. Yogananda said these communities will spread like wildfire. But that's for the future. What we can do now is we can take up these spiritual practices. We can gather in groups like this, gather together in a sangha. Yes, many of us at this time have responsibilities, and we can't easily just pull up and leave Mumbai or leave other cities. We're kind of stuck here. And so we may be stuck in a place physically, or we may be rooted to a place physically and have responsibilities. But we don't have to be stuck spiritually. We are given these techniques, spiritual techniques, because they will begin to free us from those ways of thinking, those ways of acting and reacting that make us unhappy. That's really what it's about. Yoganandaji's first book, The Science of Religion, he said that everyone in this world is motivated by one thing. Everyone. And that's the desire to be happy, and its counterpart, the desire not to be unhappy or to be out of pain. And so everything that we do has that motivation. But different people define differently what's going to make them happy. A thief defines, I'll be happy by stealing some money from that person. Or as it's said, when a pickpocket meets a saint, he only sees the saint's pockets. And so, depending on our mindset, we decide what's going to make us happy. And then we chase after that, whatever we've decided is going to do it. For some, it's possessions and financial security and so on. For others, it's relationships. For others, it's power. Yoganandaji said it's like a donkey that is stubborn. And so the donkey driver ties a stick with a carrot on it, on a string, in front of the donkey's nose, about a foot away. The donkey sees that carrot, wants it, and takes a step. Well, then the carrot is still a foot away. And he takes another step, and it's still a foot away, but pretty soon the donkey is moving on, moving on, moving on. Wealth is that carrot. No matter how wealthy you get, either you see that wealth alone does not make you happy, or you still hope that more wealth, if you only have a few crores in the bank, then you need many, many more crores, and you keep working after that carrot, or power, or whatever. And so it is that we keep moving after the things of this world, but happiness doesn't lie outside of ourselves. If we get that carrot, we're only happy for as long as it takes to chew it and swallow it. And then what? We have to look around because we've been trained that happiness is outside of ourselves. We have to look around for something else to chase. And so we go on this chase day after day, month after month, year after year. A whole lifetime goes by. We still aren't satisfied. More lifetimes, more lifetimes. Eventually, we have to understand that our happiness lies within ourselves, not outside of ourselves. It lies in our reactions to things, our reactions to circumstances, not in things and not in circumstances alone. And so, if it's our reactions, then it becomes obvious if we want permanent happiness, we have to learn to control our reactions. And that is the purpose of the science of yoga, is to help draw the energy in and to teach us that movement, we're happy when the movement goes up and we're unhappy when it goes down. So if we can learn a science, a technique that helps us draw the energy back into our own interior self and learn to control it and lift it up, then we have the keys to happiness, and happiness will lead us eventually to an uplifted state of consciousness, inner happiness, not outer happiness. Inner happiness will lead us to an uplifted state of consciousness, and in that state of consciousness, we will find our own God-given spirituality that has always been there, always will be there. Ultimately, we came from God, and we're seeking to return to God. We came from joy, and we're seeking to return to joy. As the great Saint Anandamayi Ma said, joy is the natural food of the mind, and we will always be hungry until we feast on that joy. And so feasting on that joy, which is the joy, the innate consciousness of our divinity, is the true purpose of life. And Kriya Yoga and living according to a cluster of techniques that help us control the reactive process, Kriya Yoga is the key that unlocks that feast of joy.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. I'd like to also share a few words with you today. First, thank you for coming, and we're so glad to be with new friends in Mumbai. As we've mentioned earlier, our teacher, Swami Kriyanandaji, who we were with for the past 45 years, he passed away in April. But one of the great gifts he gave us was to give us confidence and faith in our own spiritual ability and potential. And at a certain point a few years ago, he said, all of you who have really made an effort in this lifetime, you should set as your goal to become Jivan Muktas in this lifetime, freed while living. And that seemed like a pretty steep goal to me. And Jyotish and I were talking about it one evening, and I said, you know, that's a very fine thing, but I don't really think that for me I'm capable of reaching such a high goal in this lifetime. And Jyotish gave me a wonderful answer. He said, you had better expect it, but then have plan B. And so in other words, set your sights very high, but also have a backup plan. Well, for all of us, I think sometimes when we come and we hear such a nice lecture as we're having this evening on the science of yoga and Kriya Yoga, it's all very nice to listen to. But then we go home and we think, oh, but I'm not really, that's not for me. I've made mistakes in my life. I don't have the energy to commit myself to dedicated spiritual practices. But we need to remember something very important. It is not by our own efforts that we are able to grow spiritually. In fact, I would say it is entirely not by our own efforts that we grow spiritually. It is the grace of God and Guru. But we have to want to make progress. In Swami Kriyananda's autobiography, The New Path, he talks about a vision that Yoganandaji had as a young man before leaving India to come to the West. And in this vision, he was in a marketplace, a very busy marketplace in a village in India. And he looked around, and there were the housewives and the children and the merchants and the street dogs, very crowded and noisy and busy and dusty. And he noticed that every once in a while, someone would look up and see something and kind of sigh and then go back to the dusty marketplace. And he wanted to see what they were looking at. And so he went off to the side and he looked up, and there was a beautiful mountain, a beautiful snowy peak, distant and holy, shimmering on the horizon. And he looked up at it, and just as the rest of the people there, he said, oh, I would love to reach the top of that mountain, but it's so far away. I'll just stay in the dusty marketplace. And then Yoganandaji was a great spiritual warrior, and something in him said, no, maybe I can't reach the peak, but I will put one foot in front of the next, and I will see how far I can get. And so for me, and for those, my Guru Bhais who have committed their lives to a spiritual search, I think this is a very useful attitude, and I offer it to each of you. Maybe you consider yourself not a very spiritual person. Maybe you think, oh, I'm too busy. But take whatever steps you can. And every step, remember I said, it is not by our own efforts that we make spiritual progress, but truly it is the grace of God and Guru that add their blessing, their magnetism to our efforts to give it power. And so when we come to the science of yoga, that's why it's so important to see Kriya Yoga and all the techniques of yoga as both a science and an art. A science in that there are specific techniques and practices that have evolved from India over time immemorial, from the great Himalayan masters and the great sages of India who drew from a higher consciousness techniques that we as struggling devotees, struggling humanity, could practice to free us from the bondage of karma and maya. But at the same time, it is an art. And that art, we have to tune in to those who have gone before us, to those who have found the path to God. Just as if we want to learn any technique in this world, we can struggle along by ourselves, whether it's music or athletics or whatever it might be. But if we go to someone who has mastered that technique and apprentice ourselves to him or her, study from that person, try to draw the consciousness of that person, then that enhances our own techniques. So I want to share something because I hope many of you will begin taking the meditation classes that we offer here in Mumbai or come to our retreat center and community outside of Pune. But I want you to remember, because something very important, if we think of the science of yoga only as a technique, and we have been teaching now in India in many different cities, Ananda Sangha, for about 10 years. And people come and they take the basic meditation, then they take the next step, and some stay on and then receive Kriya Yoga. But some of them say, well, I did all the techniques, but I haven't found God yet. Well, first of all, it takes a while, it takes some time. But secondly, that's why I say it's an art. You cannot get there by techniques alone. Some of you may be familiar, there was a great American humorist in the 19th century in America, Mark Twain. He wrote Huckleberry Finn, Tom Sawyer, and so forth. But at one point, he was a delightful man and traveled all over the world giving lectures. But he had a bad habit that he cursed a lot. He used a lot of foul language. And one time his wife got very upset with him and she said, I just wish you wouldn't have to use that bad language all the time. But he didn't change. And so she said, well, I'm going to teach him a lesson. I'm going to start using that bad language and see what it sounds like. So she began cursing and using bad language. And finally he looked at her and he said, my dear, you have the words, but not the tune. Meaning that, and it's the same with the practice of the techniques of yoga. We can do all the outward things, but if we don't have inner attunement, we won't get very far. And I say this with deep sincerity. So you can go right through and get Kriya Yoga technique and initiation, but we need to understand that the art of all the techniques of yoga are to tune in to the great line of gurus and Yoganandaji, Kriyanandaji, who have given us this teaching. Even though they no longer are in the body, it doesn't matter. The technique of Kriya Yoga is something, as Jyotish was saying, it is basically a pranayama technique, but that's just to prime the pump. That's just for us to get a sense of what an upward flow of energy is like, until the more we practice it with depth and subtlety, we ourselves begin to get a sense of how to work with that inner flow of energy in the astral spine and bring it up to higher centers of awareness that lead us to liberation. But we cannot do this by our own effort. The grace of the Guru, Yoganandaji often used the example of a bar magnet. You take a piece of iron, and what's the difference between a piece of iron and a magnet? Well, essentially, in an unmagnetized piece of metal, all the molecules are randomly placed. The north and south polarity is random. So there's no power that goes through it. but then you run some electricity through a bar of iron or place it next to another magnet, and the molecules get aligned. So all the north axes and the southern poles of the molecules, and so energy can flow through it. Now, how do we magnetize that bar of iron? Just as I said, one way is by running a strong current of energy through it. We can think of that as Guru Diksha. The other one is to place it next to a magnet. And that's our own inward effort with Guru Darshan, to feel the Guru's grace within us, to meditate on it. Our teacher, Swami Kriyanandaji, said he would meditate as though Yogananda were sitting inside him and try to feel that flow of energy coming up from the base of the spine, that the Kundalini power coming up to the Gathusta Chaitanya, the seat of higher consciousness here. And so when we begin the practice of yoga, we need to tune in to those who have gone before us and who have harvested the full crop of God realization. And so with these techniques, we need to understand that they are given to us not to use them mechanically, but really to open our hearts. There's a beautiful story of one of the little leelas between Radha and Krishna and the gopis. And once the other gopis were going off to meditate, and they said, well, to Radha, who is the closest to Krishna? They said, aren't you going to go and do yoga? And she said, I can't take my mind off of my beloved Lord long enough to practice yoga. So we need to understand ultimately the highest technique is simply devotion. And it's through that devotion that the mind becomes focused, the heart becomes open, we can receive the grace and the blessings and the inner guidance of the Guru. And then when we practice our techniques, when we practice the science of Kriya Yoga, then that grace flows through us. And without it, we can make some advancement, but there'll always be a door that doesn't open, and that is the door of the heart. And the title of our discussion today was Kriya Yoga, Portal to God Realization. Well, ultimately, that portal is opening our heart in devotion and dedication. And I want to leave you all with this thought. Don't separate yourself from your own higher self. Don't think, I'm not worthy, I'm a material person, I'm too busy. You will never be happy in the most profound sense until you realize you are a child of God. That's why Yoganandaji came to the West. It's why he came into this world at this time with this great line of gurus to help us to say, at this time, we can awaken from our slumber that we are limited human beings and awaken into our full divine potential. And that's why Yogananda said, and I love to quote him, he said, the time for knowing God has come. And so for each of us, don't just listen to our words, but take the next step in your own life, because it's only by doing that we begin to climb that mountain. Even if we take one little step, that step will begin to help us to cross the ocean of delusion and arrive at the shores of true and lasting happiness in our life. So thank you for. Now I'd like to also invite to come up now and join us Nayaswami Jayaji, who is the director of Ananda Sangha here in India. And Jayaji will join us, and we want to give you the opportunity to ask questions. And so Jayaji is very good at answering questions. So we invite you to direct your questions to Jayaji.
As Devi ji said, we would like to now open the discussion for you to have a chance to ask questions. And I'll defer some of those questions also to our two guests here this evening. As they introduced, in their introduction, they mentioned that I serve here in India as the director of Ananda Sangha's work, based mostly in Pune. And this is my opportunity to invite you to visit us in Pune. It's only 3 hours, 3.5 hours away. And there we have retreats and we have classes at our ashram, which is a short distance outside of Uttunde in the countryside. We've been developing there for the last 5 years a very beautiful retreat. And within the last year, we've made a nice breakthrough in being able to provide facilities that we can actually now accommodate guests. And so please consider to come and visit us in Pune. So I'd like to invite these questions that you might have, but I'm going to anticipate, just to get you started, I'm going to anticipate one question or two. One that I think if I was in your situation listening to this discourse, I would be asking, well, how do I get started with this? I mean, we've talked here about Kriya, what the technique, what do we need to do? How can I get started? What's the next step for me? And I would go back or to just reference my personal experience. I too met Swami Kriyananda, and I'm not going to talk that long, but or will I? I don't know. It's a temptation. But I met Swami Kriyananda at roughly the same time as Jyotish and Devi ji in 1968. And when I met him, I was visiting him in one of those classes that he was offering. And after the first class, I went up to him and introduced myself, and I asked the question, Swamiji, lovely class, I enjoyed it very much. I would like to know, how can I learn Kriya Yoga? And perhaps you too are having that same question. And he answered me in a very straightforward manner. And he said, I'm going to ask 3 things of you. You need to do 3 things. And in a sense, it's those same 3 things that we, in one form or another over the years, we have been asking others as well. And so this is, if you have this interest, I'll say this. He said the first thing, he says, you need to understand what you're embarking upon. In other words, to just embark upon taking initiation in a technique without understanding a little bit about it is he didn't recommend it that way. He says, understand what it is. And by that, he meant learn a little bit about the background, just as Jyotish has begun to explain, but understand the teachings and the heritage and this, you might say, the scientific side of what Kriya is all about. What is meditation about? And so consequently, when people come to us and they ask, how can I get started? We offer to you a series of classes and to allow you to be introduced to what Kriya is about, to understand the foundation, so that when you practice, you have an understanding, you might say a roadmap, by which you can follow that map to attain the goal that you're seeking. We'll be offering some of those classes beginning in December. I believe our next introductory class will be in December, and you can stop at the table outside. I believe we have some literature that will give you the details of those classes and also subsequent ones that will follow. There'll be, I believe this first one we're doing in December will be done here at this venue, and so we invite you to come at that time. The second thing that Swamiji asked or responded when I asked him that question, one, he said, you need to understand, study what you're about to embark upon. The second thing is he said you need to develop a daily routine of sadhana. You need to practice. You see many people, unfortunately, and perhaps even at that time, and at my age at that time, I was inclined that way. We like to know intellectually many things, but intellectual knowledge is not to be confused with actual daily practice. And this, you might say, is the obstacle that many of us have, that hurdle of actually doing something about what we learn. And so, again, in these classes that we will introduce you to a series of techniques, preliminary techniques, that by practicing those techniques you will, as Jyotish said, it will prepare you to be able to receive that Kriya, so that when you receive that initiation, you'll be successful. It's been my experience that those who do not develop themselves and practice preliminarily to prepare themselves, to simply receive the technique, to receive the knowledge, and then go about their lives, rarely make good progress, because they have not developed the foundation and the routine and the self-discipline as well to actually incorporate the blessings that are the potential. And finally, the third thing that Swamiji said to me, he said the third thing, besides understanding, knowledge, practice, he said, I need to get to know you a little bit better. Now that has many implications, but ultimately there is a certain transmission of blessings that take place as we initiate disciples into the technique of Kriya. And so it's not an outward intellectual knowledge of your occupation and who you are, but in a sense there's a heart connection needs to be made as we pass on this tradition from spiritual generation to spiritual generation to spiritual generation. This is what's taking place. And so, yes, on a heart level, you might say, or on a spiritual level, we need to come to know one another as spiritual family. And so, in a sense, when we begin to practice Kriya, we are joining a large spiritual family of devotees that number, I don't know how many, but it's perhaps in the millions by this time, as has been mentioned. Many, many Kriya bonds have been initiated into these techniques, and you too, that potential is there for you to join this great spiritual family. So I invite you to participate. Now, questions? Please, and Sergio, if we need to, somebody in the back needs to pipe up, you can help repeat that question if needed. Any questions, please? Oh, good. This is what I was asking for. Yes, this is what I was asking for.
There's a program. I think he did.
I just made it.
I'm
I'm going to come down here so I make sure I hear you.
Regarding this program, I want to know.
Oh, hey. Oh, okay. The question is?
The question is, what is eligibility? Eligibility. Anyone can join?
Yes.
And what is the highlights and what are the benefits of this program?
Okay.
What are the highlights and benefits? I think we're part of this.
Okay, let me just explain. As you can read, no, he is giving me a brochure or a flyer that is, I think, available here on the book table of a program, one of the programs that is coming up. Now, this program is entitled Paramahansa Yogananda's Advanced Healing Techniques for Body, Mind, and Soul. And this is going to be given here in this venue on November 24th on Sunday. And it's a 6-hour workshop. This is not one of those preliminary programs for a Kriya preparation program. This is a standalone program that will introduce the techniques of healing, spiritual healing, energetic healing, that Paramahansa Yogananda taught as part of his broader mission of sharing these teachings with the public. The preliminary programs that I was referencing will start in December. But this program, in 2 weeks' time, everybody is invited. It's open to the general public. And when Yogananda came to the West, and when he came, or even when he traveled in India throughout the world, He came with a world mission to show how the techniques of Kriya, how the techniques of spirituality that underlie the spiritual path can be applied in many different ways. How they can be applied to make us successful in daily life, how they can improve our relationships with other people, how they can help us to raise families, how they can help us to deepen our spiritual practices, and specifically in relation to this workshop, how they can be used to improve our physical, mental, and spiritual health. And he devised very specific techniques of how that were developed to be able to allow us to do that. And so at this workshop in 2 weeks, we're going to be discussing the principles of good health from a spiritual perspective, and you could say, let's say, from a yogic perspective. Now, I think perhaps many of you who have some interest in these teachings, because you're here this evening, probably know some aspects of yogic principles. We're going to discuss those, but Yogananda had very specific techniques for that. And so it's not something we need to go into tonight, and we'll reserve that for the workshop. But everybody is invited, and if you would like to understand these techniques and would like to develop them within your own practices, please come. 2 weeks' time, I'll be joined by, I serve as the director I actually serve as the co-director in India of Ananda Sangha's work with one other acharya, Nayaswami Dhyana, who's also, his picture here is on the brochure. She is the director of our work in North India and is the director of our ashram in Gurgaon. And she will be coming, whereas I serve mostly in the southern half of India, and she will be coming to join me, along with a medical practitioner, a Kriya-Bond medical doctor, Dr. Aditya, Brahmacharya Aditya, will also be joining us for that. So please come. And did I answer that question? Maybe a little too long. Yes. Yes, you'll be able to learn. There's very specific techniques that will be augmenting your practices that you've learned already in the level 1 and 2? Yes, the answer is yes. Now, yes, ma'am. I want to move to some other questions. Yes, sir.
Can I sit and ask you or should I stand?
That would make it better.
Yeah, I just wanted to know whether this Kriya Yoga that you were talking of regularity in practice that is required. Now, what is the duration of the practice that one has to do, I mean, whether it's meditation or whatever it is that is Kriya Yoga. I mean, how much time in a day do you spend in this?
Why don't you?
Well, she's asking, I hope you could all hear, how much time per day do we spend doing this? In order to receive the initiation into Kriya Yoga, we ask that you develop a spiritual practice of meditation with the preliminary techniques, generally of at least an hour to an hour and a half each day. For most people, much of that is in the morning. And this gentleman said he had gone through level 1 and level 2. These are progressive class series that teach you how to meditate and how to practice some of the preliminary techniques. And so gradually over a period of a year or so that it takes to prepare for Kriya initiation, you learn how to incorporate the basic techniques of meditation into your daily life. And generally speaking, it needs to be a firm practice of meditation twice a day. Usually we ask about an hour to an hour and a half, because the Kriya technique doesn't just stand alone. You can't just do it and then walk away. You have to, in each meditation, you do some preparatory techniques. Then the Kriya technique itself withdraws the energy and uplifts it. And then in that uplifted state, you really want to have time to try to commune with God, commune with your own higher self. And so in the practice of Kriya Yoga, it takes some dedication of time but not enormous amounts of time.
I have two questions. The first question is that can you briefly describe what are the various components of Kriya Yoga, not the entire technique, but what are the components of Kriya Yoga? That's question one. And question two is what is the ultimate goal of doing Kriya Yoga?
Okay, I'll answer both of those. Some of the components of Kriya. First of all, it takes deep concentration. It's a technique that uses breath, uses a breathing technique, along with a kind of interior mantra or sound. And with that, and with deep concentration, it withdraws the energy into the spine. In other words, for those of you who have studied yoga, Patanjali talks about the successive withdrawal of energy. Pranayama is energy control, and pratyahara is Yogananda described pratyahara, or defined it as shutting off the sense telephones, that which disrupts the mind and keeps it restless. And so what Kriya does is withdraw the energy and concentrate it so that the sense telephones, we can achieve the state of pratyahara. It's only then that we can go into the deep meditation that will bring us to union with God. And what is the ultimate goal of it? The ultimate goal of it is enlightenment, or union with God, or samadhi. And so the practice of Kriya Yoga, one could say, stands midway in Patanjali's Eightfold Path. The first steps are more outward. Yama and Niyama describe those steps of how we act in this world, the things that we shouldn't do, and the yamas, the things that we should do. Asana describes a straight spine, how to sit, how to relax. And then pranayama is, one could say, central in that progression. That's where we begin to withdraw the energy. Yoganandaji talked about the senses as being like spotlights. And those spotlights, the five senses, the spotlights of those senses are constantly going out. And so they draw our attention away from our interior self into things outside of ourself. And in that, we begin to think that our happiness also lies outside of ourself. So Yogananda said we must turn those searchlights of the senses back in and rediscover the interior world, or the spiritual world. And so Kriya Yoga is the science of doing that, partly through pranayama, partly through deep concentration, use of willpower, but also through, as Devi ji was mentioning, through a disciple-guru relationship that draws also the grace of God. And so those combined help us to gradually concentrate our minds, to get rid of the restless thoughts, and to ultimately bring our attention to the spiritual eye, or the kutusta, and at that spot to commune with God and go beyond the sense that we're separate. The real central teaching of all spiritual paths is to overcome the ego. The ego is the delusion that we're separate from God. And so if we can get rid of that delusion, then we automatically realize our unity, or yoga. The yoga means unity. So that's the ultimate purpose of Kriya Yoga, which is to bring us to the highest states of consciousness.
Further questions?
What are the techniques involved? What are the techniques involved for meditating on God? Yogananda says meditate on God.
Yes. Yes, one of the techniques, Yogananda defined meditation as deep concentration on God or on one of the aspects of God. And there are different aspects of God. Light is an aspect of, there basically in the scriptures it talks about 8 aspects of God. Light, sound, power, joy, love, wisdom, calmness, peace. So we concentrate, for instance, with Kriya Yoga, we concentrate inwardly, and then at the end of the outer practice of Kriya Yoga, we would concentrate on one of these aspects of God. For instance, light, and we try to see light at the point between the eyebrows. If we can see that light, as we concentrate more deeply, and it takes the mind not being restless, so as we concentrate more deeply on that aspect of God, which is one of the ways that He manifests Himself, then we become absorbed into that. And as we become absorbed into that, the sense that we're made of light begins to come over the consciousness. And that breaks down this ego, this sense of separation, because all the world is light. In the autobiography of a yogi, when Yogananda was just a young boy, 6 or 7 years old, he describes an incident where he was sitting in his bed and he said, the thought came powerfully into my mind, the question, what lies behind the darkness of closed eyes? And so he looked into the darkness that he saw with his eyes closed, and gradually he beheld a light. And that light grew and grew, and it became totally enveloping of him. And then in that light, manifesting out of it, he saw some yogis and mentally asked, who are you? And they said, we are the Himalayan yogis. And he had this, from that time on, this great yearning to be them. It's kind of a remembrance of his past great incarnations. Then he saw that light becoming Ishwara, and he was absorbed in that light, and he said that he received from that a permanent spiritual legacy. And so after the practice of the technique of Kriya, then we try to commune with an aspect of God, light or sound or peace or joy. But here I'm talking about light. Here Yogananda, he became absorbed into that light, and it broke down that sense of separation. And we see that everything in creation is made of light, or everything is made of sound, and that God's peace is everywhere, and so on. So, yes, the meditation is deep concentration on God or on one of His aspects. And Kriya helps to interiorize and calm the mind sufficiently so that we can carry on that true state of meditation.
You can learn Kriya Yoga at any of our centers here in Mumbai. Pune, we have initiations. In fact, Jyotish and I will be going to Chennai in 2 weeks. We'll be doing a Kriya initiation there for people who have been taking the training and have prepared themselves. And we offer it in all of our many centers throughout India. We have a wonderful website, anandaindia.org, and that will tell you about our work throughout India. And what was your second part of your question? How many levels? Okay, there is the basic initiation first, and then there are 3 higher Kriya initiations after that. And those are given when one has become somewhat proficient in the first technique. How many levels leading up to Kriya?
I think it's 5. 4.
With-
4 levels lead up to Kriya, 4 class series, and then Kriya initiation is the 5th.
Okay. All right. Oh, one more question. And Jayaji, why don't you take this one?
The question, in case you did not hear it, is what changes in lifestyle must we make also while we're practicing and also leading up to it? to Kriya, it's important to understand that when we speak about level 1, level 2, 3, these techniques or levels of classes that lead up to initiation, and then we speak about Kriya initiation, we must remember that all of those levels are actually part of the Kriya technique. The Kriya science embraces all of it. It just happens that some of the techniques that we introduce without initiation, and there are some that are the higher ones that we introduce with initiation. Now, as part of proper Kriya science, we have to understand that Kriya is also a way of life. It's not just a technique. Now, Jyotish, I believe, mentioned, or both Jyotish and Devi inferred that and mentioned that we also have to live a life that is going to be in harmony to allow us to be able to receive the blessings of Kriya. So imagine that you are driving an automobile and you're stuck in the monsoon rains, the mud comes and you're stuck in the heavy mud. Now, if you try to push that car out, your friends come to push the car out of the mud, but if half of your friends are pushing from one side and half of your friends are pushing from the other side, you're not going to get out of that rut that you find yourself in. So it is with us. We have to align ourselves all in alignment so that our energy is moving harmoniously together in one direction. So if we look at our lives, we will see that we are not always in alignment. Bad habits, ways of living that do not complement us to allow us to make spiritual success. All of these things, these have to be brought into alignment as well. And this is some of the topics that we discuss in our preliminary classes that we offer. Oftentimes, Kriya can be thought also as an offering of ourselves to God. It's what we're doing is we're offering our desires, we're offering this life force, this prana that we're revolving in the spine. If we can devotionally think of this as an offering, and we also offering our restless mind when we meditate, but how can we offer something as a gift that we don't own? You see, we don't own our own thoughts, but they're restless. You're not in control, so how can you offer something that's not yours? First, we must bring those thoughts into control. We must bring these habits be able to manage them, and then we can begin to offer our lives. So we have to live a life that's regulated. The basic tenets of proper living have to be adhered to. All of these are setting the stage so that when we receive initiation in Kriya, then we're going to be successful. But I don't want to go into the specifics because these are the topics, of course, of the classes that we offer, and we would be here quite a long time. So I'm going to leave it at that. But please come, attend, and I think we can go into these things more further. So I think we close. Some final announcements.
You know, sometimes people ask us the question, well, I've read that I can just go to another ashram and receive Kriya Yoga in a weekend. Why do you teach it in many different classes? And we have been training people in and guiding them in the Kriya Yoga technique for many decades now. And yes, people can go and get it in a weekend. And then 6 months later, we get a call from these people from many places in the world. And they said, you know, I got Kriya in a weekend, but I don't remember it. I can't do it. I'm not practicing it. I'm very discouraged. You can't get it in a weekend. You have to prepare yourself, as Jyotish was saying, by regular, consistent meditation, by developing a long sadhana, by changing habits, dropping things that make you restless and externalized in your consciousness. And then when you've really prepared the soil, then when you plant the seed of Kriya Yoga, it really can take root. And so it's worth the effort to take the time to prepare your consciousness for when you receive that diksha and that technique, that it's a significant moment in your life, as in truth it is. Okay, Sergio.